Hello folks, welcome to Chapter 21, the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand.
What's the monetary policy? The supply of money set by the central bank. Remember, our assumption is that money supply is only decided by the central bank. In the United States, it's the Fed. Fed will decide the monetary policy. That's our assumption. And for fiscal policy, usually it covers the government spending and the taxation. These two parts are the fiscal policy. Recall the AD curves, at the beginning of today's class, I reviewed these three effects, right? The wealth effect, the relationship between P and C. If P price decrease, then C will increase, or AD will increase. The interest rate effect, which is the most important, all right? This is the most important, and that's what we are going to learn in Chapter 21. The interest rate effect is the most important of these three effects for the United States economy. So the interest rate effect, we talk about the relationship between P and the investment. Your price level decrease, then interest rate decrease. Always positive relationship. In that case, investment is going to increase, or AD is going to increase. The last effect is the exchange rate effect. That's the relationship between P and the NX. If P decrease and again R decrease, positive relationship, NCO increase. Then the supply of dollars increase, the exchange rate depreciates, and the net export increase. That will cause AD increase. So those are three effects we learned in Chapter 20. Why the interest rate effect is the most important in the United States? Because that counts a huge percentage of GDP. The wealth effect is less important because money holdings are only a small part of household wealth in the United States. And for the exchange rate effect is less important because imports and exports are a relatively small percentage of GDP. And that's the reason why this one is the most important. So next, what we are going to learn is the money supply demand model that helps us explain the interest rate effect. Because this is the most important effect. So we are going to learn how monetary policy will affect the interest rate and which will affect the aggregate demand curve. The theory of liquidity preference. Keynes thinks that interest rate adjusts to bring money supply and money demand into balance. Remember, for money supply, it's only decided by the Fed. And for money demand, which means the household want to hold the money in currency in liquid form. So which means you can imagine yourself, if the interest rate is higher, you want to save more money in the bank, or you want to borrow fewer money from the bank. So in that case, the money demand will be lower. If the interest rate is lower, you maybe want to borrow more money from the bank, or if you want to save fewer money in the bank. And in that case, the money demand will be higher. So that's the reason why the real interest rate is going to adjust to bring the money supply and the money demand into balance. And the assumption that the expected rate of inflation is constant. The money supply, again, assumed fixed by central bank, doesn't depend on the interest level. The Fed will not consider the interest rate or price level or the value of money. They just consider how much money they are going to supply in the market. It's fixed. For money demand, reflects how much wealth people want to hold in liquid form. We also have assumptions here, like for the household wealth includes only two assets, money or bonds. For money, there is no interest rate. For bonds, pay interest rate, but not as liquid. So only two assets for money demand. A household's money demand reflects its preference for liquidity. So variables that influence money demand, Y, R, and P. We have learned P before as the quantity of money we need. That's the 1 over P. That's P. For over P, that's large or big from bottom to the top. For P, from top to the bottom, that's big. Because one is 1 over P, the other is P. And for money demand, it's downward, right? Money demand. So which means if price level is increased, then money demand should increase as well. That's P. Why? Y is going to determine the money demand. Because Y is the real income. If real income Y rises, the households want to buy more goods and services, so they need more money. The money demand will increase. To get this money, they attempt to sell some of their bonds because we assume that there are only two assets for household. One is money, the other is bond. And the increase in Y causes an increase in money demand if other things are equal. Y is the real income. Real income increase, then people want to buy more stuff. In that case, people are going to need more money. How R is determined? Money supply is vertical, as we learned before from the last picture, right? That's money supply, and that's 1 over P, the price of value, what we learned before. The money supply is always vertical, decided by Fed and the money demand. MS, money supply is vertical, so change in R do not affect money supply, which is fixed by the Fed. That's our assumption. Money demand curve is the downward sloping. A fall in R increase the quantity of money demanded. When R decrease, so people can borrow more money, right? Because the cost is lower, then money demand is higher. Or supply, or say, I'd better write it here. If interest rate is lower, the investment should higher, so they need more money. Or if the interest is lower, people are going to save fewer money. S is going to decrease, or consumption is going to increase, which means they are going to need more money. So which means a fall in R increased in the quantity of money demand. And here, you can compare these two graphs. The left one, the vertical axis is the interest rate. The diagram, what we learned before, the vertical axis is 1 over P, the value of money. So actually, these two can kind of equal to each other. Because the interest rate is the value of money, right? Because if the value of money increases, the money, we need more money, then the interest rate will be higher. If the value of money decreases, which means money means nothing, we do not need money, then the interest rate is going to be lower. So you can imagine that interest rate is the value of the intersection between the money supply and the money demand. That's the equilibrium of interest rate. So, for example, a fall in P from actual price level reduces the money demand, which will lower R. Since P decreases by the same amount of product, we do not need as many or as much money as before, which means the money demand will decrease. Money demand decrease, the MD shifted to the left-hand side. because MIS, money supply, doesn't change. It's decided by the Fed. So interest rate is going to decrease. If the interest rate decrease, that will increase investment. So why is going to increase? Please remember the logic in this picture. The first thing change is the price change. If price decrease, no matter increase or decrease, that will change the money demand. And the money demand will change the interest rate. Interest rate will change the investment. Investment will change the final Y. Alright, that's the logic here in this slide. So the Fed can use monetary policy to shift the AD curve. Changing like this are what we learned before. What the Fed can use monetary policy to shift the AD curve? The first is changing the reserve ratio. Reserve ratio is if R decrease, which means the reserve ratio is going to increase, and that will increase money supply, right? And that if money supply change, then that could cause the interest rate change, and that will change the aggregate demand curve. The other is changing the discount rate. That is R. If R is decreasing, which means for banks they have more incentive to borrow more money. So borrow increase, which means reserves increase. And if banks have more reserves, then the money supply increase as well. Changing in the federal funds rate, the same as the discount rate. But for the federal funds rate, that's the interest rate the banks charge each other on short-term loans. So this one is the interest rate. Is the interest rate if banks want to borrow from the Fed, and the federal funds rate is the interest rate if banks want to borrow from the other banks. But the logic are the same. If R decreased, more incentive to borrow more money, which means more money supply. And also the last one, the conducts open market operation to charge money supply, which means if Fed buy bonds from the market, which means pay the money to the banks, which means money supply is going to increase. So there are 4 different ways for Fed to change the money supply or the monetary policy. We have learned 4 different ways for Fed to change the money supply. Then the Fed can raise R by reducing money supply, right? By using one of those 4 strategies to decrease the money supply. If money supply decrease, which means interest rate will increase. If interest rate increase, that will decrease the investment. That will decrease the aggregate demand curve. This logic is how Fed influence money supply or change the monetary policy, which influence the interest rate and influence the investment. As a result, to influence the aggregate demand curve. So please remember this logic. How Fed influence MC, influence R, influence I, and influence AD. Because MIS is hard to measure with sufficient pressure and marginal demand, money demand fluctuates over time. That leads to fluctuations in interest rate and aggregate demand. Fed policies can set the target for federal funds rate, accommodates the day-to-day shifts of the money demand by adjusting the money supply accordingly. So monetary policy can be described either in terms of money supply or in terms of interest rate. Before what we learned, the money supply is going to change the monetary policy. The four strategies are going to change the money supply, right? But what's the Fed want to change the money supply's policy? The Fed's real aim is to change the interest rate, because the interest rate R is going to decided by I. Sorry, it's going to determine I. It's going to determine AD. The only reason why the Fed is going to change the monetary policy wants to change the aggregate demand curve. So that's the Fed's monetary policy's aim. Changes in monetary policy aimed at expanding aggregate demand curve. For each of the events below, and determine the short-run effect on output, and determine how Fed should adjust the money supply and the interest rate to stabilize the output. Remember what we learned from the last slide? The only aim for money supply is to determine the interest rate and to aggregate, to increase or decrease the aggregate supply curve. So money supply, determine the R, determine the I, and determine the AD. The only aim for a Fed to change the money supply, the aim is just to change to adjust the aggregate demand. So let's see these three events. Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending. If Congress cuts the government spending, which means the G decrease and the AD decrease, right? AD decrease. That's what happened already. But for the Fed, it has to stabilize the output. So what the Fed's aim want to increase AD. So what Fed can do should increase the money supply and reduce R to increase the aggregate demand. So the event for A, if AD decrease, then the Fed's aim is going to increase AD to increase the money supply. A stock market boom increase household wealth. So which means consumptions. If there is a boom, then consumptions are going to increase. Consumptions increase and the aggregate demand curve increase. That's for B. But again, for the Fed want to stabilize the output, the Fed is going to decrease the aggregate demand curve to stabilize the output. So the Fed should reduce money supply and increase R to reduce the aggregate demand curve. For C, war breaks out in the Middle East, causing oil price to soar. If oil price, that's the cost for the suppliers, right? If cost, that's the cost. If cost increase, which means the short run aggregate supply curve is going to decrease. If that decrease, which means AD is going to decrease. So what's the Fed's aim to stabilize output is increase AD. So if Fed is going to increase AD, should increase money supply and reduce R to increase aggregate demand. So the zero lower bound. If Fed wants to increase the productivity, increase Y, the Fed is going to lower the interest rate, right? But what if the interest rate is already lower to zero? What will happen? Some economists think that that will cause the liquidity trap. The trap is if interest rates have already fallen to around zero, which means monetary policy may no longer be effective. Because the monetary policy means if the Fed is going to decrease the money supply, that will raise the interest rate. If the monetary policy is to increase the money supply, then the interest rate is lower. That will increase the total aggregate demand. But what if the interest rate is already zero? Then the monetary policy to increase the money supply will no longer to lower the interest rate lower or to increase the aggregate demand to stimulate the economy. So the aggregate demand, production, and employment may be trapped at low levels. However, some other economists think a central bank continue to have tools to expand the economy even though the interest rate is already equal to zero. These economists think or suggest like two ways. The first is forwarding guidance, raise inflation expectation by committing to keep interest rates low. Because in this way, the Fed is going to tell you there is a good future. So, which means people do not hesitate to invest because they think if there is a good future, then they are going to invest. They do not need to worry about like if they can sell their products in the future or something like that. So, in this way, people is going to keep investing. Even though the interest rate is already zero at this moment. So the Fed can change people's expectation, which can change the aggregate demand curve. That's the first way. And the second way is quantitative easing, which means buy a large variety of financial instruments, including mortgages, corporate debts, long-term government bonds. Because usually the Fed is not going to buy this amount of instruments, financial instruments. What the Fed usually buy just the short-term government bonds because that's safe. But during the financial crisis, like during 2008, the financial crisis, and that's what Fed was doing during that period. Except the short-term government bonds, which is safe, the Fed also buy others. In this way, they are going to give more money to the bank. So, which means the money supply increase. That will another way to increase the economy or something like that, to stimulate the productivity or something. So that's what happened when the interest rate already is zero and two different opinions. Okay, so far we have seen effect of monetary policy on aggregate demand curve. So how about the fiscal policy influences the aggregate demand curve? So the fiscal policy again is including the government purchases and the taxation, right? These two are called fiscal policy. An increase in G or decrease in T that will shift AD to the right. Because no matter increase in G, that means more spending, right? Or decrease in T that will increase the consumption. And both of these will increase Y. So that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And the opposite is a decrease in G or increase in T that will decrease the aggregate demand curve and is going to shift the AD to the left. So fiscal policy has, for example, such as for monetary policy, usually the Fed's aim just to stabilize the output. So usually that was what we learned to shift the aggregate demand curve. But for the fiscal policy, it has two effects. One is a multiplier effect, and the other is crowding out effect, which is what we are going to do. Think about this one. Assume the government buys $2 billion of military trucks from Oshkosh corporations. What's the effect of this purchase on aggregate demand? So this is typically the government purchasing, right? That's G. If G increases by $2 billion, what will happen? the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right by $2 billion. That's easy to understand because government spend this amount of money directly. And after that, what will happen? The Oshkosh's revenue increased by this amount of money because that's the revenue from the government. And from that corporation, it could distribute that amount of revenue to workers or owners or stockholders, whatever. In that way, this group of people's income, real income, increase because of the government spending increase. So this group of people are also going to consume more because their real income increase. They're going to use some of their actual income to consume some goods and services, which is going to increase aggregate demand curve more than what the government spent before. Which means when the government spends $2 billion for something, no matter what, and that's money that will increase the aggregate demand curve, not only just by $2 billion, but by more, because the people who earn that $2 billion are going to spend more. So this is what this slide shows. A $2 billion increases in G initially shift the AD to the right by $2 billion. That's what the initial effect from the government purchases. But the increase in Y also causes Z to rise, which shifts the AD curve further to the right. So this movement of this effect called the multiplier effect, which means the additional shifts in aggregate demand that result when fiscal policy increases income and thereby increases consumer spending. How big is the multiplier effect? Well, it depends on how much consumer respond to increase in real income. Remember, because the multiplier effect is just when consumer earn more real income, they are going to use some amount of the income to buy something. So it depends on the marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity to consume stands for MPC, equals to delta C over delta Y. That's the fraction of actual income that households consume rather than save. Because with the new income, the consumer are going to decide how many amount to use to consume and how many amount to use as saving. For example, if MPC equals to 0.8, when the income rise $100, so C, the consumption is going to rise $80, which means the consumer is going to use $20 as saving. So notation delta G is the change in G and the change in Y as well. Beginning, we have learned this equation, Y equals to C plus I plus G plus net export. And if we assume that I and the net export do not change, so which means delta Y change, the change of output only depends on the change of consumption and the change of the government purchases. Because delta C equals to MPC times delta Y, because that's the definition of marginal propensity of consumption, right? So we can substitute the delta C to MPC times the delta Y. And to solve delta Y, we can get this equation, new equation, which means 1 over 1 minus MPC. This equals to multiplier. So this is very important. You need to remember this one. The multiplier equals to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. So calculate the spending multiplier when MPC equals to 0.5, 0.75, and 0.9. So the multiplier equals to 1 divided by 1 minus np. The calculation should be easy, right? If you can remember this equation, all you need to do just plug in the different numbers, substitute MPC. So if MPC equals to 0.5, the result, the same calculation over here. So you will get the result as 2, 4, and 10. Which means the bigger MPC it is, the bigger multiplier. Because when MPC is big, which means 1 minus MPC is going to be smaller. And which means 1 over 1 minus MPC is going to be big. So the bigger MPC, the bigger the multiplier. A big MPC means changes in Y cause a big change in C, which in turn cause a bigger change in Y. The multiplier effect. From the example, it means each $1 increase in G can generate more than a dollar increase in aggregate demand, because the consumers are going to use the real income, the actual real income to consume. So that's the multiplier effect, but that's also true for other components. In the example, we learned if the government purchases increased by like $2 billion, what will happen? But except the G, there are also other components like both C, I, G, and X. Any components of these four increase, that will increase the aggregate demand curve as well. So all of these is called the multiplier effect. Not only G, but also all components or elements here. And also the multiplier effect also called the investment accelerator. How big of a change in AD? Suppose a recession overseas reduces the demand for US and net export by $10 billion. What's the initial change in AD? Initial change, that's easy, right? Because Y equals to C plus I plus G plus net export. If net export reduced by $10 billion, which means Y, the total output of aggregate demand curve is going to decrease by $10 billion. That's the initial change in AD. But because of there is a spending multiplier, the total change of AD is not only by $10 billion. You should also calculate the spending multiplier, which equals to 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. The multiplier equals to 5, which means the total influence, the total effect would be the multiplier 5 times the initial decrease, which is $10 billion. So the total amount, the total change of aggregate demand would be $50 billion. All right, so which means the multiplier really means a lot. If the initial change is only $10 billion, but the final result was $50 billion. If the MPC equals to 0. So, as I said, there are two effects for the fiscal policy. The first is the multiplier effect, and the other is the crowding out effect. For the multiplier effect, that is the accelerator, right? But for the crowding out effect, that's the opposite direction. That will offset the in aggregate demand. Results when expansionary fiscal policy raises the interest rate. Because when the government spends more money, which means the government needs more money before they can spend, right? If the government want to collect more money, no matter borrow bonds or issue bonds or whatever, that will raise the interest rate. So, which means when the government want to spend more money to collect a huge tax, that will raise the interest rate, thereby reduces the investment spending, which reduces the net increase in aggregate demand. So that's the opposite direction compared with the multiplier effect. So the size of the AD shift may be smaller than the initial fiscal expansion. For example, here, the same example as what we learned before. Last time we learned that for the multiplier effect, if the government spend $2 billion, then the AD is going to shift to the right-hand side by $2 billion because of actual income costs actual consumption. So the AD is going to shift further. But in this one, let's see what happens. Assume the government again spend $2 billion. But $2 billion increase in G initially shift AD shift to the right-hand side by $2 billion, the same as what we have seen before. But higher Y, higher output, increase the money demand. Because the quantity of goods and services increase, right? And then you need more amount of money to buy this fixed amount of goods and services, or actual amount of goods and services, which means the money demand curve is going to shift to the right-hand side. Because during this period, when the Fed fixes the money supply, which will cause the interest rate increase, and in that way will decrease the aggregate demand curve. So which means this was initial change, $2 billion, but because of the crowding out effect, that's the opposite of multiplier effect, right? So the final influence, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift by a smaller amount than $2 billion, the initial investment or initial spending. So for fiscal policy, except the government spending, we have the Fed also has another tool, is the taxation. When a tax cut happens, that will increase household take-home pay. Then household will respond by spending a portion of this actual income. That will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. This is easy. This size of the shift is affected by a multiplier and also crowding out effect, because fiscal policy has two effects, right? And the taxation is one part of the fiscal policy, so the taxation also has two effects, the multiplier effect and the crowding out effect. Another factor, household perception, could be like permanent tax cut that will large impact on AD, aggregate demand. That's easy, right? If we know that our income will increase forever, of course we are going to spend more. But for the temporary tax cut, like during the pandemic, for the specific, some special event, we know that the tax cut is not forever, which means only during this period I may increase my demand, but I still need to save some amount because in the future there is no more tax cut. So for the temporary tax cut, that will only a small impact. Think about this question. If there is no crowding out effect, then that's what we have solved before. Just use the initial amount times the multiplier. So in that way, we need to calculate the multiplier first, which equals to 1. Divided 1 minus MPC. This is the multiplier. Use the initial amount times the multiplier. If there is no crowding out effect, that's what we have. The aggregate demand curve increase. So A is very easy, right? Calculate the multiplier first and use the initial amount. Okay, if the policymaker think that shifting the AD curves right by this amount would end the recession, which means that's the final result, final effect, and divided by the multiplier or use X times. Okay, this is X. Sorry, I'm going to use another number, M. M times the multiplier, use 0.8, substitute this MPC, you are going to calculate the result is 5. And the final result is should increase by $200 billion to end this recession. And how many amount of money the government should spend? What's the G should equals to could end this recession? So M equals to $40 billion. That's A. So if there is a crowding out effect, that will reduce the impact of G on AD, right? Because that's the opposite direction. If the government wants to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right-hand side, but because there is a crowding out effect, the final results, the AD curve is going to shift to the right-hand side, but not as many as the government wants. So in that case, to offset this, the Congress should increase G by a large amount. Last time we calculate A, the result was $40 billion. So which means because of this effect, the government should increase this G, should be higher than that. In that way, the final result would equal to this $200 billion. Fiscal policy and aggregate supply. Fiscal policy might affect aggregate supply as well. So before, what we learned is monetary policy could affect the aggregate demand, right? And also fiscal policy can also affect the aggregate demand curve. But for fiscal policy, it has two effects. The multiplier effect, which will accelerate the effect. But another is the crowding out effect, which was going to offset the government's aid. But except the factor of aggregate demand, the fiscal policy might also affect the aggregate supply curve because people respond to incentives. For example, like a cut in the tax rate, that's one part of fiscal policy. That will give workers incentive to work more. So it might increase the quantity of goods and services supplied and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Because when there is a tax rate cut, the workers can earn more money within 1 hour, right? In that case, the more time they are going to work, the more revenue they are going to earn because there is a tax cut. So for workers, they are going to wish to work longer than before to earn more money. So that is going to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. People who believe this effect is large are also called supply siders. Except taxation, G, the government spending, might also affect aggregate supply curve. For government increases spending on roads, better roads may increase the business productivity, which increases the quantity of goods and services supplied. In this way, that will shift AS aggregate supply curve to the right. But this effect may be longer. It will not happen immediately, but it will still happen. Which means in both ways, no matter taxation or government spending, both of these is going to affect the aggregate supply curve. The case for active, according to Keynes, animal spirit causes waves of pessimism and optimism among households and firms. leading to shifts in aggregate demand and fluctuation in output and employment. So in that way, what the government, what the Fed want to do is to stabilize the output. So some other factors can also cause fluctuations like booms and recessions abroad that will influence the net export. Stock market booms and crashes that will influence the consumption. So if policymakers do nothing, these fluctuations are destabilizing to business workers and consumers. If the government wants to stabilize the economy, the output, the government should do something, right? That's the case for active. So government should use policy to reduce these fluctuations. When GDP falls below its natural rate, the Fed should use expansionary monetary or fiscal policy to prevent or reduce the recession, to stabilize the economy. When the GDP rises above its natural rate, then the Fed should use a contractionary policy to prevent or reduce the inflationary boom. Again, the Fed's aim is not to stimulate the economy forever, but to stabilize the economy, to keep the output wide to the natural rate of output, right? To stabilize the economy. That's the support. But there are some other people who are against this idea or strategy, the government policy. Like, for example, what their suggestion or their argument is monetary policy affects the economy with a long lag. For example, firms make investment plans in advance, so it takes time to respond to changes in R. Like what we learned before, the monetary policy is aimed to change R, right? That's interest rate, that's money demand, money supply, money demand. The Fed is going to change the money supply. Its aim just to change the interest rate. But for investment, it takes time to respond to the change in R, which means the Fed change R and change I, that is going to take a longer time than what people think. Most economists believe that it takes at least 6 months for monetary policy to affect output and the employment. So that's a long line. Fiscal policy also works with a long line. For example, changes in G&T requires acts of Congress. Legislative process can take months or years for that happens. So again, that's a long line. For both the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, that effect will not happen immediately. So that's the argument from the critics people. So due to these long lags, critics of active policy argue that such policies may destabilize the economy rather than help it. Because by the time policies affect aggregate demand, the economy's condition may have changed. Because it's going to take a longer time, right? Say even months or years. So when the Fed's or the government's policy really affect the economy, the condition may be changed, already changed after a half a year or 1 year later. So contend that policymakers should focus on long-run goals like economic growth and low inflation. So these are the two different ideas related to the government's influence on the monetary policy or fiscal policy. But no matter people support or critics about that policy, but all of them believe that the long lag is the really matter. It's not the policy. Policy will help the economy, but the long term will not work effective or efficiently. So which is the automatic stabilizer happens. Automatic stabilizers are changes in fiscal policy that stimulate aggregate demand when economy goes into recession. That will happen automatically. Occur without policymakers having to take any deliberate actions, which means for Congress or for policymakers, they do not need to take years to figure out what the result. It will happen automatically. It will just happen immediately. That's the automatic stabilizers, such as the tax system. When recession happens, the taxes fall automatically, which stimulates aggregate demand. It will not need Congress approval or something. Another is the government spending. During recession, more people are going to apply for public assistance like welfare, unemployment insurance. But again, when the government policy or want to do that, it's going to need some time. What the automatic stabilizers are government spending on these programs automatically rises during recession, which is going to stimulate aggregate demand immediately, really fast. That will help the economy immediately. Alright, and this is the automatic stabilizers.